I reckon it started with the screaming, the kind of screaming that crawls under your skin and stays there. You hear a man holler like that and you know he's not coming back. The skirmish had gone south faster than any of us could have guessed. 1 minute we were holding the line, muskets firing in perfect rhythm like some kind of grim parade. The next, the Union boys had flanked us, and everything turned to chaos. Smoke, fire, and death choked the air, and the ground seemed to bleed beneath our boots. I'd always thought I'd die on a battlefield, noble and brave, like in the stories they told back home. But when I saw Lieutenant Carter's head snap back and half his face disappear, the only thing noble about me was how fast I could run. Call me a coward if you want, but I wasn't about to let myself get pinned to the earth with lead. The last thing I remember before the forest swallowed me was tripping over a fallen comrade. Didn't even get a good look at him, just saw the gray of his uniform and the black pool spreading out beneath him. Then I was on my feet again, tearing through the trees like a fox with hounds at its heels. The woods were quiet, too quiet. It hit me all at once, the sudden absence of gunfire, the shouting of men, the clash of steel. Gone. Just like that. It didn't feel right. My own breathing sounded like cannon fire in my ears, and my heartbeat pounded so hard I half expected it to burst out of my chest. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree that must have been older than the war itself. The bark felt rough and ancient under my hand, but there was something else. A strange warmth, like the tree was alive in a way it shouldn't have been. I pulled my hand back fast like I'd touched a hot stove. What in the hell? I muttered to no one in particular. My voice felt out of place here, too loud, like it didn't belong. I glanced around, squinting through the dim light. The trees were packed tight together, their branches tangled overhead to form a canopy so thick not even the sun could break through. The air hung heavy, damp and thick, and carried a faint, sweet smell that reminded me of something long dead. I couldn't tell which way I'd come or which way I ought to go. Every direction looked the same, just trees and shadows and more trees. Then I noticed it. The first sign. Something was wrong. A musket lay on the ground a few yards away, its barrel twisted like it had been in a blacksmith's fire. The wood was splintered and the stock blackened. Beside it was a cartridge box, the leather ate through with holes. It wasn't the gear itself that made my stomach turn, it was the way it looked. Old. Too old. Like it had been there for decades, not hours or even days. I knelt beside the musket, running my fingers over the warped metal. My hands trembled, but I told myself it was just the exhaustion, the fear still pumping through my veins. Someone must have dropped it, I whispered, though I didn't believe it. The thing was ancient, rusted through like it belonged in some museum. I stood up fast, wiping my hands on my pants. My heart raced again, that uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The first time I saw them, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Through the trees, maybe 50 yards away, I spotted movement, shapes shifting between the trunks. My first thought was Union soldiers. My second was to run. But something about the way they moved froze me in place. There were 3 of them, marching in single file. At least I thought they were marching. Their movements were stiff, jerky, like puppets on strings. They wore Union blue, but the uniforms were tattered, hanging off their frames like rags. The flesh on their faces was pale, too pale, and their eyes, God, their eyes. They glowed faintly, a sickly yellow light that pierced the shadows. I ducked behind a tree, my heart slamming against my ribs. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to steady my breathing. My musket felt heavy in my hands, but I didn't dare raise it. I peeked around the tree, just enough to get another look. They were moving in a circle, their boots stomping out a path in the undergrowth. Over and over they followed the same route, like they were stuck in some endless drill. One of them turned its head, and for a split second I thought it saw me. But it just kept turning, its neck twisting far beyond what was natural before snapping back into place. "What the hell is this?" I breathed, my voice barely audible. The words felt useless and meaningless, but saying them out loud was the only way to keep me from losing it. I stayed crouched behind that tree for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. My legs ached, my muscles burning, but I didn't dare move. The figures kept marching, their boots crunching the undergrowth in that same monotonous rhythm. The sound was maddening. Finally, I decided I couldn't stay there forever. I'd have to move soon. The longer I waited, the darker it got, and I didn't want to be here when night fell. Slowly, carefully, I rose to my feet, keeping the tree between me and the soldiers. I took a step back, then another, my boots barely making a sound on the soft earth. That's when it happened. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, my musket clattering to the ground. The noise echoed through the forest like a gunshot. The marching stopped. My breath caught in my throat as I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my musket. I pressed myself against the tree, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. Slowly, I peeked around the trunk. All three of them had stopped. They stood frozen, their glowing eyes fixed on the spot where I'd fallen. Then, as one, their heads turned in my direction. The motion was slow, deliberate, and utterly inhuman. One of them opened its mouth and a sound came out. A shriek that wasn't animal or human, but something else entirely. And then they started running. That's all I've got for now, but I'll tell you this. I didn't stop to look back. Whatever those things were, they weren't men. And if I'd stayed to find out, I reckon I wouldn't be telling you this story. But that's just the beginning. The worst of it. Well, that was still to come. They chased me, those ghostly Union soldiers, and I swear it was like the forest wanted to help them. Every root snagged my boots, and every branch tore at my sleeves, slowing me down and pulling me back. I couldn't shake the sound of their footsteps, fast and pounding, like a drumbeat of doom. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed, but fear kept me going. Fear and that shriek they'd let loose, which still echoed in my head. When I finally stopped running, it wasn't because I wanted to. My foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling into the dirt. My musket flew from my hands, landing a few feet away. For a heartbeat, I just lay there, gasping, the taste of blood in my mouth. My ears strained for the sound of those boots, but the forest had gone silent again. Too silent. I crawled toward my musket, every movement slow and deliberate. My hands shook as I gripped the weapon, turning it over in my hands like it could save me. A faint rustling made me freeze. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the undergrowth. My heart dropped when I saw them. They stood a few yards away, half hidden by the shadows. The glow of their eyes cut through the darkness like lanterns, unmoving, unblinking. They didn't come closer. They didn't have to. Just standing there, watching, was enough to make my skin crawl. "Stay back," I croaked, my voice barely more than a whisper. One of them tilted its head, the movement unnatural, like it was trying to understand me. Then, as if some invisible signal passed between them, they turned and vanished into the trees. The sudden absence of their presence was almost worse than having them there. My body refused to move for a long moment, and when I finally got to my feet, my legs felt like jelly. The forest seemed different after that. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. Every tree looked like it had eyes, and every sound was like a whisper meant just for me. And the worst part? The path I'd been following was gone. No matter how far I walked, I couldn't find it again. The forest had swallowed it, just like it seemed to swallow everything else. I stumbled upon the campsite by accident. It was tucked into a clearing, hidden from view by thick underbrush. At first, I thought it was abandoned. The tents were collapsed, the campfire long cold. But as I stepped closer, I saw the bodies. There were at least a dozen of them, Union and Confederate alike, sprawled across the ground like broken dolls. The smell hit me next, a sickly sweet stench that made my stomach churn. God Almighty, I muttered, holding a hand over my nose. My eyes watered as I forced myself to look. The bodies were in various states of decay, some little more than skeletons, others disturbingly fresh. But the thing that struck me most was their faces. Every single one of them had an expression of sheer terror, their mouths open in silent screams. I backed away, the bile rising in my throat. That's when I saw the journal. It was lying near one of the bodies, half buried in the dirt. The leather cover was cracked and worn, but it looked like it might still hold together. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up, wiping the dirt off with my sleeve. The name scrawled on the inside cover read, Private Samuel Harris, Union Army. The entries were written in a shaky hand, the ink smudged in places, but still legible. Harris had started the journal like any soldier might, documenting battles, rations, and the weather. But as I read on, the tone shifted. The last few entries were frantic, almost incoherent. June 14th, 1863. We shouldn't have come here. The forest, it's wrong. Men are disappearing. At night, I hear them calling my name. But it's not them. It's something else. Something in the trees. June 15th, 1863. They're here. I see them out of the corner of my eye, but when I turn, they're gone. The others don't believe me. They say I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. June 16th, 1863. It's not just the forest. It's the war, the hate, the blood, the death. It's feeding them. They want us to keep fighting. They need us to. We're never getting out of here. None of us. The last page was a scribbled map of the forest, marked with strange symbols I didn't recognize. One spot near the center was circled in heavy ink, and beside it, Harris had written 2 words. The General. You've seen them too, haven't you? The voice startled me so badly that I nearly dropped the journal. I spun around, raising my musket, and came face to face with another man in Confederate gray. He was older than me, his face lined with scars and weariness. His uniform was torn, his boots caked with mud, and his eyes had the look of someone who'd seen too much. Easy there, son, he said, raising his hands. I ain't one of them. Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling. Sergeant Harlan, he replied. Been wandering these woods longer than I care to remember. You're lucky you found me. Most don't last this long out here. What the hell is going on? I demanded, lowering the musket just a little. Those things, what are they? Harlan's face darkened. They're what's left of men who didn't make it out, caught in the war, even after death. And if we don't get out soon, we'll end up just like 'em. How do we get out? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. He glanced at the journal in my hands. That map might be our best shot, but if we're going to make it to the center, we'll need to be ready. The closer we get to the General, the worse it's going to get. The General? Harlan nodded. He's the one keeping all this going. The soldiers, the forest, the fightin'. It all comes back to him. If we can take him out, maybe, just maybe, we can break the curse. His words filled me with equal parts hope and dread. I didn't know if I could trust him, but he was right about one thing. I wasn't getting out of this forest alone. And if the map was real, it might be the only chance I had. All right, I said, tucking the journal into my coat. Lead the way. Harlan nodded, his expression grim. Stay close and don't look back, no matter what you hear. As we plunged deeper into the forest, the whispers started again. Only this time they were louder, clearer, and they knew my name. The whispers clung to us like fog, curling through the trees and around my ears. Each one was distinct yet indistinct, like dozens of voices overlapping but never quite forming words. They carried a cadence that made my skin crawl, a rhythm of despair, anger, and something else I couldn't place. I tightened my grip on the musket and kept my eyes forward, just as Harlan had warned me. "Ignore 'em," he muttered, glancing back at me. "That's how they get in your head." "What do they want?" I whispered, even though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. Harlan's face was grim. "To keep you here, the same way they've kept so many others." The forest seemed to close in tighter the farther we went. The trees were taller here, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and stones that made every step treacherous. I couldn't tell how long we'd been walking. Time felt strange here, stretched and warped like it didn't follow the rules it should. Finally, we came to a clearing. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk twisted and blackened like it had been struck by lightning. Its branches spread wide, casting long shadows across the ground. And beneath it, half hidden by the roots, was a figure. "There he is," Harlan said, his voice barely more than a breath. "The general." He wasn't what I expected. He didn't look like some monstrous specter or ghoul. He looked like a man, sitting with his back against the tree, his legs stretched out in front of him. His uniform was Union blue, but it was faded and torn, the fabric hanging off him like it didn't quite fit. His head was bowed, a slouched hat casting his face in shadow. But even from a distance I could feel the weight of his presence. The air around him was thick and heavy, like trying to breathe through molasses. "Is he dead?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Harlan shook his head. "Not yet, but he ain't alive either." We edged closer, the ground beneath us crunching with every step. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They sounded like pleading now, begging us to stop, to turn around. But we kept moving, and the general remained still, like a statue carved into the tree's roots. When we were close enough to see his face, I almost wished we'd stayed back. His skin was gray, like ash, and his eyes were sunken hollows that seemed to drink in the light. His mouth was twisted into a faint smile, a mockery of warmth. And his hands, they were skeletal, the fingers curled around a rusted saber that rested across his lap. "You've come a long way," the general said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in my chest. His eyes, or the shadows where his eyes should have been, fixed on me. "But you should have stayed away." Harlan stepped forward, his musket raised. "We're ending this," he said. "Whatever curse you've put on this place, it ends here." The general chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "You think I put this curse here?" he asked. "You think I'm the one keeping it alive? No, boy. This war's been going long before me, and it'll keep going long after. I'm just a piece of it, same as you." "We'll see about that," Harlan growled, taking another step closer. But the general didn't move. He just smiled that hollow smile, like he already knew how it would end. "Harlan," I said, my voice shaking. "Something's not right." "It's never been right," he muttered. "Just stay behind me." But before he could get any closer, the ground beneath us shifted. Roots erupted from the earth, twisting and writhing like snakes. One of them wrapped around Harlan's leg, pulling him down with a shout. I stumbled back, barely avoiding another root that lashed out like a whip. "Run!" Harlan shouted, struggling against the roots that bound him. "Get out of here!" But I couldn't leave him. I raised my musket, aiming at the roots, and fired. The shot echoed through the clearing, but it did nothing. The roots tightened, dragging Harlan closer to the tree. "No!" I shouted, dropping the musket and rushing forward. I grabbed at the roots, trying to tear them away, but they were like iron. The general watched us, his expression unreadable. "You can't save him," he said. "You can't save yourself. You're part of this now, just like me." But I refused to listen. I grabbed Harlan's knife from his belt and hacked at the roots with all the strength I had. The blade bit into the wood, and for a moment I thought it might work. But then the roots recoiled, pulling Harlan into the shadow of the tree. His scream cut off abruptly, and he was gone. I fell back, gasping, the knife still clutched in my hand. The general rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate. The saber in his hand glinted dully in the pale light. "You fought well," he said, his voice almost kind. "But the war doesn't end, not for you, not for me, not for anyone." He raised the saber, and I braced myself, but the killing blow never came. Instead, he pointed it at me, and the forest seemed to ripple, the shadows stretching and twisting around us. "You'll see," he said. "Soon enough, you'll see." And then everything went dark. When I woke, I was lying on the forest floor. The clearing was gone, the general was gone, and so was Harlan. The whispers were silent, and the air felt lighter like a storm had passed. But the forest was still there, endless and unyielding. I got to my feet, my legs unsteady, and looked around. The journal was still in my coat. Its weight was a grim reminder of everything that had happened. I didn't know how I'd gotten out or if I'd really escaped. All I knew was that the war wasn't over. Not here. Not ever. And somewhere, in the heart of the forest, the general was still waiting. Thanks for watching. What did you think of the story? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories like this.